In 1997, somebody cut a hole in the back wall of the Wayne County Speed Shop in Michigan. Whoever it was moved with real precision. They didn't touch the trailers sitting right there. They didn't touch the cars. They didn't touch the transmissions or the machinery lining the walls. They went straight for the engines, all 7 of them, every single pro-stock power plant belonging to the most dominant Mopar team in NHRA drag racing, destroyed in a single night, in a building that somehow showed almost no sign of forced entry consistent with the kind of damage found inside. The timing could not have been worse for anyone trying to sell this as a coincidence. NHRA had reportedly just told the team they were going to be investigated at their next event. And then, days before that investigation could ever happen, the exact evidence that investigation would have examined was suddenly gone, vandalized beyond recovery. The story went, by intruders skilled enough to avoid setting off a single alarm and precise enough to leave everything except the engines completely untouched. Nobody was ever charged. No one was ever definitively caught. And NHRA, facing a scandal that threatened to embarrass one of its biggest corporate sponsors right as the investigation was supposed to begin, quietly let the story fade instead of forcing the question everyone in the garage area was already asking out loud. Photos of the damaged shop circulated for years afterward among insiders, and to this day, mechanics who've studied those photos closely point out something odd. Parts and blocks visible in the wreckage that, according to some accounts, didn't quite match what a genuine factory Mopar engine should have looked like at all. That's just one scandal. Drag racing in the 1990s was full of them, cheating that never got proven, bans that never got fully explained, and a sanctioning body that seemed to have a very different set of rules depending on exactly whose name was on the sponsorship check. Welcome back to Regal Rides. This channel exists to tell the stories underneath drag racing's official record, the disqualifications that quietly disappeared, the accusations that never got resolved, and the controversies NHRA would rather fans forgot ever happened. Today we're counting down the 8 biggest scandals the sport tried to bury, almost all of them from the decades when the sport was at its most explosive, its most political, and its most willing to look the other way when it needed to. Stick around, because number 1 involves a cheating method so clever, so well hidden, that some people in the garage area still argue about exactly how it worked decades later. Number 8, John Force and the mid-1990s traction control accusations. By the mid-1990s, John Force was already building the reputation that would eventually make him the winningest funny car driver in NHRA history, 16 championships across his career, a name that would come to define the entire class. And that dominance came with a price. Rivals started whispering and eventually saying outright that Force's team was running a device capable of sensing an impending loss of traction, the telltale moment right before a car's rear tires start to smoke and spin uselessly instead of gripping the track and automatically counteracting it before the driver even had time to react. Traction control in any form has always been explicitly banned in NHRA's straight-line racing. The entire sport is built on the idea that a driver's own reflexes, feel, and judgment are what separate the champions from the field. Not a computer quietly making corrections a human hand couldn't make fast enough on its own. If a system like the one being described actually existed and actually worked the way accusers claimed, it wouldn't just be a rules violation. It would undercut the entire premise of what made drag racing driving skill in the first place, reducing a discipline built on split-second human reaction into something closer to a car, quietly correcting its own driver's mistakes in real time. NHRA's response, consistent with a pattern that would repeat across this entire era, was to avoid the confrontation as long as it possibly could. Tech officials reportedly didn't want the distraction of chasing down every rumor and every finger pointed across the pit road. And for a long stretch, the accusations against Force stayed exactly where accusations usually stay in this sport, discussed constantly in private, confirmed by nobody in public, never resulting in a single disqualification anyone could point to as proof either way. Force himself characteristically never let the accusations slow him down publicly, continuing to win at a pace that only fed the suspicion further among rivals who couldn't otherwise explain how consistently his cars avoided the kind of tire-smoking mistakes that plagued nearly everyone else in the class. Number 7. Daryl Alderman's federal ban, and the questions nobody wanted to ask out loud. Daryl Alderman had one of the most dominant single seasons pro stock had ever seen in 1991, driving for the Wayne County Speed Shop Dodge team. He won 11 events that year and led the NHRA championship points from wire to wire, never once trailing another driver across the entire season, finishing more than 3,000 points ahead of runner-up Warren Johnson, a margin that in a sport decided by hundredths of a second was almost unheard of and remains one of the most lopsided championship runs in the class's history. And then in the aftermath of that dominant run, everything changed. Alderman pleaded guilty to federal cocaine charges and was banned from NHRA competition entirely for the 1992 and 1993 seasons. It was a genuine scandal in every sense, a champion driver removed from the sport for reasons that had nothing to do with what happened on the racetrack. What made it a scandal NHRA seemed content to let fade quietly rather than address head-on was everything that surrounded it. The same team, the same dominant Dodge program, already the subject of persistent whispers about nitrous oxide use that were never officially proven and never fully investigated either. A driver gone for 2 full seasons over a legal matter completely separate from the cheating rumors somehow became the version of the story NHRA was most comfortable talking about, while the performance questions sat conveniently unaddressed in the background. Allowed to drift out of the news cycle while the more legally straightforward drug charges dominated whatever coverage the story received. Alderman returned in 1994, won the title again over his own teammate, Scott Jeffrian, and the whispers about how exactly that Wayne County program kept winning at the rate it did never really stopped following him for the rest of his career. Even his return itself became a talking point in the garage area, a driver who'd been away from competition for 2 full seasons, stepping back into a pro stock car and immediately reclaiming a championship. In a class where mechanical consistency and constant fine-tuning are supposed to be everything, struck plenty of rivals as its own small piece of the larger mystery, and those whispers about the Wayne County program weren't just background noise. They were about to explode into the most bizarre unsolved mystery in modern NHRA history. Number 6. The 1997 Wayne County Speed Shop break-in. We opened this video with the broad strokes of this story, but the details are worth sitting with, because almost every piece of it raises more questions than it answers. By the late 1990s, the Wayne County Speed Shop's Dodge Pro Stock program, now fielding drivers Daryl Alderman and Scott Jeffrian, had become the target of persistent, years-long suspicion that they were running illegal nitrous oxide systems, suspicion serious enough that NHRA had reportedly told the team an investigation was coming at their very next event. Before that investigation could happen, the shop's back door was cut open, and whoever got inside destroyed all 7 of the team's engines, leaving the trailer, the cars themselves, the transmissions, and the rest of the equipment completely untouched. Longtime pro stock competitor Jerry Ekman later described the break-in with open sarcasm, pointing out how strange it was that intruders had used something quiet enough to avoid detection while somehow finding time to methodically wreck every single engine in the building and nothing else. No forced entry loud enough for a neighbor to notice, no alarm triggered, and yet enough time and precision to systematically destroy 7 separate engines one by one. NHRA requires winners, runners-up, and randomly selected teams to be sequestered for engine teardown inspections after events. And with the Wayne County engines destroyed before that scrutiny could happen, nothing was ever found, because there was nothing left to find. Some observers in the sport openly speculated the break-in had been staged, either by the team itself to avoid a suspension that would have embarrassed Chrysler, or possibly with NHRA's own quiet cooperation, since Chrysler held naming rights to multiple NHRA events and provided a significant share of the series' advertising revenue at the time. Others pointed to the length of time it took the team to get back to full competitive strength afterward, arguing that a year-plus rebuild timeline looked suspiciously similar to what an actual year-long suspension would have looked like, just without NHRA ever having to formally announce one. Nobody was ever charged. No official explanation was ever fully accepted by the garage area. and the team's extended absence from competition while the engines were supposedly being repaired lined up suspiciously closely with what a suspension might have looked like if NHRA had simply chosen to hand one down instead. Decades later, online forums and drag racing history blogs still occasionally reignite the debate, with longtime fans who lived through the era trading theories about what really happened inside that shop on a night nobody can fully account for. Number 5. The nitrous oxide method nobody in NHRA officially confirmed. Here's where this story gets genuinely strange, even by drag racing standards. According to detailed accounts that circulated among mechanics and insiders in the years that followed, the method some competitors were suspected of using to hide nitrous oxide from NHRA's tech inspectors was remarkably elaborate. The theory held that nitrous was carried inside the engine block's water jacket itself, with plain water kept in the cylinder heads, where inspectors would expect to find it. A drilled passage connected a hidden compartment through one of the main bearing saddles, feeding upward into the intake ports, with a spring-loaded relief valve calibrated to release the gas only once engine heat raised the internal pressure high enough, meaning the system could sit completely inert and undetectable during a cold. Pre-race inspection. Passing every visual and pressure check an inspector might run before the engine had a chance to warm up under real racing conditions. Refilling the system, according to the same accounts, used a specially built charging gun made to look exactly like an ordinary grease gun, connected to a disguised fitting on the block that made a pit crew member topping off a hidden nitrous reservoir look, to anyone watching, like routine engine maintenance, the kind of mundane, repetitive task that draws zero attention in a busy garage area during a race weekend. And because the gas would naturally leak away after a run whether it had been used or not, a post-race inspection searching for a smoking gun would often find nothing conclusive left to test, the evidence essentially erasing itself on a timeline that worked entirely in the team's favor. Whether every detail of that account is completely accurate or has picked up embellishment over years of retelling in garage circles is genuinely difficult to verify at this distance. What isn't in dispute is that NHRA never officially confirmed any team was running a system like this and never handed down a single disqualification based on it. Former Pro Stock champion Jim Yates offered his own theory on why. In his view, NHRA had simply come down hardest on whichever competitor sat lowest in the sports food chain, rather than confronting a program with the resources and sponsorship weight to fight back. That theory alone became its own small scandal within the larger one. A respected champion essentially accusing his own sport's governing body of selective enforcement, in public without much fear of contradiction from anyone who'd actually lived through the era. Number 4. The Bob Glidden and Rusty Glidden nitrous admission. Bob Glidden was, for years, one of the most successful and most respected drivers in pro stock history, a champion whose name was spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for the sport's absolute pioneers. And for years there was a persistent, widely held belief running underneath that reputation that Glidden himself had used nitrous oxide during the peak of his dominance, and that his sudden decline from the top of the sport came not from age or bad luck, but from NHRA quietly telling him to stop or face public exposure. Around 1996, that whispered theory got about as close to confirmation as it would ever get. Rusty Glidden, Bob's own son, admitted to illicit nitrous oxide use in his Pro Stock Ford Probe, shaking the drag racing establishment in a way few admissions from within a single family ever had. By that point, NHRA's patience with repeated nitrous accusations surrounding the Glidden name had reportedly already been exhausted for years, forcing the sanctioning body into a reaction it had clearly been trying to avoid for as long as it possibly could. There's something almost tragic about how this scandal played out, a legendary name, built over more than a decade of dominance, quietly undercut by the exact kind of suspicion that had been swirling around Pro Stock's biggest programs the entire era. Never formally investigated and resolved while it might have mattered most, only surfacing into something close to an admission once a member of the next generation said the words out loud. It raised an uncomfortable question that NHRA never really answered for its fans. If the son's admission was credible enough to shake the sport, why had years of near-identical rumors about the father never produced so much as a formal inquiry while Bob Glidden was still actively winning championships? And if you think the nitrous era was just about individual teams cutting corners, one of the sport's most respected engine builders had a very different and far more explosive theory about who was really being protected. Number 3. Warren Johnson's public accusations against NHRA and its biggest sponsor. Warren Johnson spent years as one of the fiercest and most technically respected competitors in pro stock, and he eventually said, publicly and directly, what a lot of people in the garage area had only ever said in private. Johnson pointed to the financial relationship between Chrysler and NHRA. Chrysler's naming rights on major events, its substantial contribution to the series' advertising revenue, and argued that relationship had a direct bearing on how NHRA chose to handle nitrous allegations against Mopar teams compared to everyone else. He went as far as suggesting the financial burden Chrysler was carrying for the sanctioning body at the time had a direct bearing on the method NHRA used to address suspicions about its own team. Dodge's public relations team fired back hard, calling Johnson's comments unsubstantiated and irresponsible, and pointing out that Alderman and Jeffrian had been formally exonerated in the Wayne County break-in investigation. Whatever that exoneration was actually worth given how little physical evidence had survived the break-in to investigate in the first place. Both Daimler-Chrysler and NHRA publicly denied that any special treatment or favoritism had ever been extended, framing Johnson's remarks as the frustrated grievances of a driver who'd simply lost more races than he'd won against a superior program. But Johnson's underlying argument that a sanctioning body financially dependent on a manufacturer's sponsorship dollars has a genuine conflict of interest when that same manufacturer's team comes under suspicion is one that's difficult to simply wave away, whether or not his specific claims were ever proven. It's the same fundamental tension that would explain almost everything else on this list. A governing body that needs its biggest sponsor's money is never fully positioned to investigate those same sponsors' teams with total independence, and every driver, mechanic, and fan in the garage area during this era seemed to understand that tension implicitly, whether NHRA was willing to say it out loud or not. Johnson's willingness to say it publicly, using his own name and reputation, is part of why his accusations carried more weight in the garage area than the usual round of anonymous grumbling that followed most of the sport's biggest teams. Number 2. Dyno Don Nicholson's acid-dipped Maverick. Stepping back a couple of decades earlier, before Pro Stock's nitrous era, drag racing had already produced a scandal built on an entirely different kind of engineering deception. By the early 1970s, acid-dipping steel body panels to shed weight was an open secret across Pro Stock garages. Teams would lower panels into acid vats, letting the chemical eat away at the metal until it was a fraction of its original thickness. Nicholson's Ford Maverick became the version of this story that's been retold for more than 50 years. According to garage legend, when his crew pulled the shell out of the tank, sections of the roof and pillars had been thinned down to something closer to foil than genuine structural steel. Officials weighed the car, remeasured it, ran their hands over panels that flexed under a thumb in a way real steel never should have, and found nothing they could technically disqualify, because NHRA hadn't yet written a minimum thickness requirement into the rulebook. Nobody had anticipated a team pushing the process this far. NHRA never publicly confirmed exactly how extreme Nicholson's car had actually been. They simply rewrote the rules in the seasons that followed, quietly closing a gap that one Maverick had exposed completely, letting the specific car and the specific driver fade into legend rather than into a formal scandal with his name attached to a public ruling. In a strange way, Nicholson got the gentler treatment history reserves for innovators rather than cheaters precisely because there was no explicit rule for him to have broken in the first place, a distinction that wouldn't be nearly as forgiving for the teams caught up in the nitrous scandals 2 decades later. Number 1. The 1972 Professional Racers Association breakaway. If every other scandal on this list is about a hidden trick or a suspicious investigation, this one is different. It's about the entire foundation of NHRA's authority nearly collapsing under pressure from its own biggest stars. By the early 1970s, tension had been building for years between NHRA's leadership and its top professional racers over purses and politics, over exactly how much control competitors actually had over the sport they were risking their lives to compete in. Don Garlits, one of the most respected and recognizable names in drag racing history, ran out of patience. Alongside a group of investors, he launched the Professional Racers Association in 1972, a direct organized challenge to NHRA's authority, born out of genuine accumulated fury from exactly the racers NHRA depended on most to keep fans in the stands. A rival promoter saw the opening immediately and jumped in to sanction the breakaway events himself, personally guaranteeing the purse money to lend the new organization real credibility. The result was races like a $25,000 to win event in Tulsa that became legendary in the sport for how much money was suddenly on the table entirely outside NHRA's control, drawing top-tier competitors who'd never seriously considered racing outside NHRA sanctioning before. This wasn't a quiet grumbling in the pits, easily buried or waited out. This was drag racing's own biggest stars, organizing publicly to build something outside NHRA entirely. A genuine existential threat to the sanctioning body's grip on the sport it had spent decades building. NHRA couldn't disqualify its way out of this one because it wasn't about a part, a rule, or a suspicious engine. It was a direct referendum on whether the racers themselves still trusted the people running their sport, and for a tense, uncertain stretch in the early 1970s, the answer from some of the biggest names in drag racing was a resounding no. The financial backing behind the breakaway movement came from multiple directions at once: oil money from some investors, family wealth from others, and Garlits' own accumulated frustration fueling the project as much as anyone's checkbook, which is part of why NHRA couldn't simply wait the movement out the way it often waited out smaller, individual grievances. Here's what ties every one of these scandals together. From a mysterious break in 1997 back to a full-blown racer revolt in 1972, NHRA has never really had a choice between having controversies and not having them. Every governing body in a technical, high-stakes sport eventually runs into the same problem. Someone finds a gap the rulebook didn't anticipate. Someone gets accused of exploiting it, and the sanctioning body is forced into a decision it would clearly rather not make. What separates NHRA's era of nitrous whispers and quiet investigations isn't that the scandals were unique to drag racing. It's how consistently the sport's governing body seemed to choose silence over resolution, letting engines get destroyed before an investigation could happen, letting a champion's decline go unexplained for years, letting accusations against its biggest sponsor's team dissolve into insufficient evidence rather than a clear public ruling either way. Every one of these stories, in its own way, is drag racing holding up a mirror to itself. The sport kept promising fans a level playing field, and across an entire decade, competitor after competitor, insider after insider, quietly suggested that promise depended heavily on whose name was on the sponsorship check. What's remarkable, looking back at this stretch of the sport's history now, is how little of it was ever definitively resolved one way or the other. No confession that fully closed the book on Wayne County. No official document that settled exactly what happened to those 7 engines. No final ruling that told fans, with certainty, whether the water jacket nitrous story was fact or elaborate garage area folklore. Drag racing simply moved forward, era to era, driver to driver, carrying every one of these unresolved questions quietly along with it. If you made it through all 8 of these, I want to hear your take in the comments. Which of these felt the most deliberately buried, and which one do you think NHRA still owes drag racing fans a real answer on? Hit subscribe if you're new here, because we cover stories like this every single week. Thanks for watching.